It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this session and to have the opportunity to hear Michael Deere, who has pioneered so many different areas of our discipline for so many years. He's a continuous machine of creativity, and I'm so delighted to have him here to kick off to keynote the special track of sessions on borders that we're holding at this meeting here in Los Angeles. Michael has just come out with a new book. It's called Why Walls Won't Work. Great title, from Oxford University Press. He'll be keynoting this topic generally, but also specifically referring to his book. I think most of you know Michael, but I'll tell those of you who don't that Michael is a professor of city and regional planning at the University of California, Berkeley, an honorary professor in the Bartlett School of Planning at University College, London. Michael's current research focuses on comparative urbanism and the future of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. He was a founding editor of the scholarly journal Society in Space, Environment and Planning, D, and he's a leading exponent of the Los Angeles School of Urbanism. His many books include From Chicago to LA, Making Sense of Urban Theory, Post-Border City, Cultural Spaces in Bajalita, California, and The Postmodern Urban Condition, which was chosen by Choice Magazine as an outstanding academic title in 2000. His latest edited volume, which I had the privilege of working as a co-editor with him on, was entitled Geohumanities, Art, History, Text at the Edge of Place. And there's no doubt that Michael provided substantial and intellectual leadership for that volume. It was a great pleasure to work together with you as well, personally, I must add. Michael's a very generous and kind person, and when you're working with a group of editors, that's a very wonderful talent to have and also to receive the benefits from. Michael has participated in the Fulbright Specialist Program. He's been a Guggenheim Fellowship holder, a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, and fellow at the Rockefeller Center in Bellagio, Italy. That's the trip I wanted to go visit him on, but I never worked out. He has received the highest honors for creativity and excellence in research from the Association of American Geographers and numerous undergraduate teaching and graduate mentorship awards. It was a great pleasure that I give you Michael Deere.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here and honored to be introduced by the executive director of the association, no less. And I'll just tell you that I really, really enjoyed working with Doug as well. Quite a character, really. I'm here to talk about the borders theme, and in particular to talk about the book, Why Walls Won't Work. This is the border, for those of you who have no idea about where the border is. If you're coming to Los Angeles for the first time, you are already at the border, because LA is certainly a border city. And those of you who know me and know my work with respect to Los Angeles might be a little bit surprised to see me talking about the US-Mexico border, but it's a very small step from LA to the border. And I made that step some years ago when I was trying to understand the big megalopolis that we call Los Angeles. And then I got increasingly intrigued by the border, increasingly overwhelmed by it, really, because it is one of the most misunderstood places on the planet, I think. It's very far distant from the centers of political power in DC and DF. It's staunchly independent, many cultures, hybrid loyalties. And nowadays, the border states are among the fastest growing regions in both nations. This is not a place to mess with. Is really, really important to the prosperity of both nations. I started in a small, modest way in 2000 to travel the US-Mexico border because I thought I really ought to know it better. And a lot of silly things happened along the way, but a few years later, I managed to complete the journey. It's a total of 4,000 miles, and since then, I've been back several occasions to really get to know it a bit more. So I guess I've clocked around 10,000 miles at least now in traveling along the border on both sides. It's been an eye-opener for me. And the longer I traveled, the more I became less interested in immigration, less interested in drugs, less interested in national security, and more interested in the places that I was experiencing, the communities along the border, what I'm going to call in this presentation the Third Nation. I'm prepared to defend that if you wish, but I'll just assert it for the moment. I did not go on the trip to court danger. I did not come back with lurid accounts of beheadings, etc., etc. We know that the border can be a dangerous place, and the only tip I'll give you as a long experienced traveler there is when you first encounter a US Border Patrol agent who's wearing camouflage uniforms, assault weapons, grenades, and everything else, you freeze, you stop, and the next thing you ask yourself is not what arms this person is carrying, but how old is this person in front of me? This is not an ageist statement. But as a very famous folk singer, whose name I can't remember right now, said at one point, don't trust anyone under 30. The Border Patrol agents under 30 are new to the game. They like their toys, and they love their authority, and they're dangerous. It's the old guys I really like who have been on the line for about 20 years, and they've seen everything, and they're calm. And I like that. So there might be an opportunity to tell you more small rules to survive at the border with. It's not difficult to succeed. I was very interested in looking at this place, and it really has taken over my life for some time. And what I really want to talk about is this Third Nation, the notion that along that line, there are a series of communities which identify a separate place, an in-between place, if you want to be sort of technical about it, a liminal space. But I warn you, too, this is not an academic book. This is what Oxford calls a trade book, and there's very, very, very little theory in this book. It's more about the place and what it meant to me and what it should mean to everybody. So I went searching for the origins of the Third Nation, and I made so many mistakes along the way. It's one reason that the book took me so long to produce. I looked at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, thinking that's when the border was formed, and I got it solved. I did not. I had to go back to colonial era to really find out the sources, and then beyond that into prehistoric times. If you look at this zone, back at prehistoric times, you basically understood that it's been a connected zone forever. The walls that have gone up in the past decade are the aberrant historical affect, not really anything else that you can see. Now, I mean. So when you look at the distribution of various indigenous groups down South Mesoamerica, which everybody thinks about when we talk about Mexico, and this spectacular area called La Gran Chichimeca in the north of Mexico, or what is Mexico now, and Baja California too, all these had flourishing indigenous cultures in the old days. It was not a simple question of Mesoamerica and its cultures dominating everywhere. That didn't happen. And indeed, the connections between the Anasazi, the Hohokam, and the Mogollon tribes in the contemporary U.S. Southwest represent one continuous landscape in motion. Of course, there was no border then. I merely want, in a brief signature way, to emphasize to you the kind of connectivity that existed. Look, too, at this one, would you? This is the amazing Comanche Nation in the early 19th century. And the extent of this subcontinental empire should be staggering for anybody who's interested in indigenous cultures. You know, if you still see, as I occasionally do, the occasional John Wayne movie about what it was like during the times in this era, it was nothing like that. And this map is from only a Finnish author, whose name I can't pronounce, Hahakilim or something like that. Forgive me. But the penetration of the Comanche Empire into northern Mexico, almost down to Mexico City, to the Gulf Coast. This was a subcontinental empire of some renown. It was fantastic. So, I mean, before we settled the war with Mexico, we were looking at all sorts of connections. These arrows represent merely the raiding lines that these people followed in this part of the world. A truly remarkable civilization. So the origins of the Third Nation is one very important piece of the puzzle. And I want to emphasize here that the later edition of what we now regard as the fixed international border was truly that, an aberration, and not something that's been there since time began. Nation-state boundaries are very peripheral, ephemeral phenomenon, as we know. Now, the interesting things that happened around the 1846-1848 war was a series of surveys that were done. And I got to regard the two people who were responsible for the majority of the surveys, Emery and Salazar, as real heroes, because they had an incredibly difficult time putting this survey together to put the border in place. The boundary survey began officially in 1849, and it took about 6 years to complete. It was very hard going indeed. The historian Carl Wheat calls this the stuff that dime novels is made of, because there were lots of conflicts and so on. This is absolute nonsense. This story of the survey, which is very well told by Paula Rebert amongst others, is a truly important, significant, amazing piece of our history. And I'm very happy to draw attention to it at this moment. The point was that over the next 4 or 5 years, there was a series of surveys which began with a California survey and then continued down the river and also the Rio Grande and the Rio Bravo, and then 2 interior surveys. The important monuments were constructed at the puntos iniciales, the initial points of the survey, and they were the ones that were made of marble, and the people who were dealing with them really hated them. The diaries at the time are full of complaints about these 5-ton monuments that they had to put in place. But more often than not, at that time, the boundary was marked by a pile of stones. Now you can imagine that these are difficult to see and they were difficult to preserve. Just for a comparison, there's the 1854 monument that went up at the Playas de Tijuana, the first punto inicial, a marble monument, and this is a photograph of its renovation in 1892 when the second boundary survey was established. So we're looking at a situation here where an absolutely staggering series of surveys went on to create the border. Remember now, too, that when you think about this era, the first thing to remember in terms of my presentation is the words that everybody said at that time and still do to this day. The border moved, not us. The communities who were there stayed there. An international boundary was imposed on them, and several historians of this era have pointed quite eloquently and interestingly to the changing nationalisms that were encountered during this time. Mexican, American, all these sorts of things all jumbled up. A second survey became necessary because the population that expanded along the borderline toward the end of the 19th century made it very difficult to determine where the line was. So the second survey, which took place on the land boundary, established the line again. It took account of the fact that some of the original surveys were wrong, and they kind of fudged on that so as not to have to rewrite the treaties. They also had to deal with the fact that some of those stone mounds were destroyed by Indians who were pissed off at the occupation. They also were destroyed by American settlers, who, when they came down and saw a stream or a particular resource that they saw a little while further on, they picked up the boundary monument stones and put them further over. So the land was now in the United States. And you can tell, this is one of my favorite photographs of the second survey. Some of the, when you draw a line on a map and you don't look at the relief, you create havoc for people who have to cart their steel. This is the 1892 style monument. And the guys, you can see, are standing there saying, God, thank God for that. And let's just hang around and get another photograph so we don't have to go to the next one of these and drag them up the mountain and stick them there again. So after the second survey, the border was pretty much established, and the border actually settled down, especially after the Mexican Revolution. What really is interesting, and this is the only sort of gesture towards academic interest that I'll go to at the moment, is the way in which the border twin cities I don't know how well you can see that, but it's, as I said, it's just a gesture in the sense that the dark zones are the American side, the US side, and the lighter zones are the Mexican side. You will see from the large numbers associated with these that a large number of US border cities are predominantly Mexican. That's a large number. Calexico, 88%, San Luis, 83%, and so on. Now, that border territory, it's important to know, was left open for most of the 20th century. We have not had walls. We very rarely had fences. And for the most part, a large part of the border was unmarked. You could wander across and do pretty much anything. I've lost track of the number of people, our filming person included, who's basically already told me stories about how in the old days you wandered over and you fed your cows or played whatever you did on the other side. And nobody paid much attention to a border. It was a very informal, loosely marked, haphazardly maintained, and casually observed line in the land. By the mid-1990s, however, tensions begin to arise, and we got the beginnings of the first fences being established in major settlements like Tijuana, El Paso, Juarez, and so on. These fences were established basically using temporary landing mats that had been established during the Vietnam War. You know, the engineers would come down, they'd lay them flat, they'd clip them together, and you could land a plane or a helicopter on them. Somebody recycled them from Vietnam, put them up on their edges, and they had the fence. And you see from this close-up, which I love because you can just about see some of the Border Patrol implements on the other side. But you can see the way it was stepped. It was very easy to put your fingers and toes in and climb up to the top and jump over. So this Operation Gatekeeper, as it was called around this region, or in San Diego, was the beginning of the fortification. But it was nothing like the fortifications that followed then in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. This is just to remind you what it's like. And this zone is actually pretty much still the same. I was there a few months ago. So on your right, there's the Vietnam War landing mats. Then there's a kind of like a highway divider as the fence peters out, right? And then beyond that, the fence just stops. Fence actually goes up the hill a little bit right now, but it's still not a complete fence. Understand, the fence, although we spent $2 billion on this, is now still only 80% covering the land boundary section of the territory. You can still walk through at that point if you're so inclined. The post 9/11 attacks changed everything. Changed everything because the United States decided to fortify that territory and prevent any further incursion based on concerns about national security, based upon immigration, et cetera, which are now flourishing into large-scale problems. We built the fence. And in San Luis, Colorado, for example, this is a 25-foot high solid steel wall, steel manufactured in Vietnam, if you're interested. And this is the primary fence, which prevents vehicles from crossing. You can tell, or you can guess, I'm sure, at this point, that one of the principal causes of going to hospital at that time was broken ankles by people who would leap over the fence. That was the secondary fence behind it, and the tertiary fence too. So this is a very wide strip now where land has been sterilized, and between the fences there are high-speed chase zones available to the Border Patrol agents. It was during this time that we now began to see not only the formal fence as structures like this, but also a virtual border put into place. Oh, by the way, that's the floating fence in the Algodones Dunes, where you can't put the fence into the sand. It's not stable, so you've got these buttresses. They should have asked a geographer to help them, because even the most elementary sand physics would tell you that blown sand, when it hits a fence, is going to drop to the soil, to the floor, right? So now you can tell, you know what's happening. I mean, these fences are getting buried as the sand builds up against it. It was really stupid. But they spend a lot of money cleaning the sand out. We've got a virtual border down there as well. We spent millions of dollars putting up towers that didn't work, but there's lots of new toys out there, and that's a small indication of the virtual fence which your tax dollars are now paying for. So you can feel very happy that that's around. And moreover, the strategies which are implemented by the Border Patrol people who are involved in these kinds of defenses are truly impressive. Look at this, for example. This is a border calculus from the Department of Homeland Security. I have no idea what it means. It basically talks about the PIA, the potential illegal action, who then becomes an IA, an illegal immigrant, at the vanishing point. You have about 2 minutes to intercept that person as they approach the fence, and you can tell what we can and what we can't do. I find it completely confusing, but totally convincing as an indication of the geometry of security spaces in this current era. Don't try to really understand it. I want to also remind you that we have, along with a virtual fence, along with doubling the number of the Border Patrol agents, the fastest growing category of federal employment in the past 10 years. Along with doing that, we've built a gulag. I think that's the best way to think about it. See, in the Bush era, and I'm not going to be very polite about the Obama era either, but in the Bush era, we set in place a mechanism for the apprehension of migrants, detention, prosecution, and deportation. The big achievement, if that's the way to put it, of the Bush era was the rise in apprehensions, which went from something like 200,000 a year in the 1970s to almost 2 million at its peak in the Bush era. The Obama era continues a lot of Bush era stories and practices, but the Obama era, if you call Bush's era the apprehension nation, you can call the Obama era the deportation nation, because our deportation rates are now running at 400,000 a year. Now, watch those figures for a second, right? If your apprehension rates are now back to 1970 levels, around 200,000 a year, and if your deportation levels are at 400,000 people a year, elementary arithmetic in that case tells you that you've actually contained that problem. I'm going to assert that the border is over. The border is over at a zone of conflict for immigration control. The emphasis clearly shifted in the Obama administration to interior enforcement. These are the checkpoints that you see when you drive along a border freeway. These are the workplace enforcements. These are the labor place raids, the promises to apprehend people who have overstayed their visa. All those things have emphasized the fact that we've shifted to immigration control in the interior. And along the way, we've created this enormous apparatus for detention. These are the private detention centers in this country. Okay? Now, we have created what I'm going to call a border industrial complex. There are other ways you could describe it. But basically, one of my concerns at the moment is the infrastructure for immigration control is in place. We spend billions of dollars on it. We spend, I think, I can't remember the number of billions of dollars ICE and the Border Patrol costs us during each year. But these are private detention centers, and they are truly like a gulag around the edge of our nation. And they are subject to so many complaints and so much abuse, I can't begin to talk about that. So the image that I want to build up for you, and I'm going to try to start bringing this to a close. The image that I want to bring up for you is of a border which is already been in place, but a border control apparatus which fundamentally isn't working. This is a proof for you that people who want to get into this country can get over, under, through, and around the wall if they really, truly want to. Now, this particular person wasn't thinking too much of the wheelbase on the SUV and got stuck there. And I draw your attention to the fact, of course, that the sand, you can see the sand accumulating at the bottom of the fence there. Somebody will be around with a vacuum cleaner later in the day to try to clear that out. Let me bring this to a close. The real point that I want to convey to you is the continuity in these places, the continuity in the border zones. I will argue with you, I will press the assertion that the border is over at the zone, but the amount of damage that has been done there by inflicting the security apparatus on the border zone is something that we need to really consider. I mean, the way to describe it, as far as I'm concerned, is that the United States and Mexico have decided to use the border zone as free territory for conflict. The conflict basically on our side is that we want to stop immigration. Conflict on the Mexican side is that we've got a problem with the drug cartels. I'm not diminishing the importance of these issues, but you understand that it's in our national interest to contain the cartels. It's in our national interest, this is the way the arguments go, it's in our national interest to contain the immigration issue, and we've elected to put the burden of containing those issues at the border zone. If you want to be technical for a second, it's a matter of concentrated costs and distributed benefits. Distributed benefits for the nation as a whole. We've got peace. We can control immigration. But in the meantime, we royally screwed up the border zone, the people who have been bearing the cost, the people who have lived in the third nation since Mesoamerican times. Wait a second. See, I'm not going to make comments about immigration reform. I'm not going to make comments about the cartels. I'm just saying to you, the situation has changed so dramatically in the last 10 years. It's time to pay attention to that third nation. It's a game changer. It's necessary to have a game changer in this situation. You can see this in one of these photographs. This is on Avenida Internacional in Nogales. At the top, there's the contemporary surveillance instruments. In the middle, you'll see the 1990s gatekeeper fence, the Vietnam War era fence stood on its side. In front of that, in the center of the image, you've got Monument 122A, which is put up in the 19th century, right? And then underneath that, you've got a retaining wall. The point about the retaining wall, and you can't see it too well here, on the concrete retaining walls, somebody has painted images of Mesoamerican ideas of life and death. So for me, I mean, this, apart from the photograph at the beginning on the front cover, which I really, really like, this captures the whole layered nation of the archaeology of the border for me, okay? You've got the Mesoamerican era, you've got the fencing of the Vietnam era, you've got the 19th century monument, and you've got the 21st century surveillance, all in one set of archaeological arrangements. To draw things to a close, of course, I couldn't resist this one either. This is a manhole cover down at USC's campus, just about where my office used to be, and it just captures it all. And there's another manhole cover in Mexicali in Baja California, and it says City of Mexicali made in LA. It truly does, but I haven't found it yet. So what's going on? What's going on is I really want immigration reform that's currently being talked about to succeed, because I think that's going to go a large way to relieve some of the tensions between the two nations. The wall will come down. Walls always come down. You know, Berlin Wall was torn down almost overnight. The Great Wall of China is now a tourist attraction. And I've been around this wall long enough to know, and this is in Tijuana once, when there were retired LAPD officers offering security when they're building a fence, because if they didn't watch the fence materials, it would disappear overnight. So Mexican recycling is the most efficient recycling you'll ever see anywhere in the world. If you leave that fence alone, the recyclers will take it down very quickly. If they don't, then souvenir hunters will take pieces, and then Mexican people, US people who are simply offended by the very presence of this object in their lives will take it down. We should preserve some sections of it. We should preserve some sections of it. You can put it in the Smithsonian if you like. It's a recommendation I made in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. Put a piece of it in the Smithsonian to remember the times when we as a nation really lost our way. We lost our moral compass. And I think it's a long time overdue that instead of looking more and more at the obsessions which we've had in recent times, now that some of those obsessions are being dealt with, now that immigration control or immigration reform has basically rocketed to the top of the agenda in the nation, and we know why, of course. But let's take advantage of it anyway. Now that's happening, I really would recommend, and this is the fundamental underlying message of the book that I've just completed. I want us to look back again at that third nation, to preserve it because the well-being of both nations depend upon the way it works, and to look again at a way in which we can easily live with neighbors to the south of the border. If we want to know how Mexicans and people from the US get on with each other, you can actually go out in the streets in this border city and see it. If you go down to border cities, you can see it on a daily basis because they've been living together for centuries. They get along very well. We can learn from these people. We should help them, not simply put all this detritus of partition into their lives. They put all this police apparatus that people in Arizona call their own state a police state. We should do better, and we can do better. So I'd like to end now and call on Michael Deere to accept any questions from the audience. But thank you very much for listening. Oh, before you go, you all have to buy 10 books on the way out. I forgot about that. I will take some questions, and we have a few minutes if you are so inclined. If you're not, I'll just go back to my presentation. Keep talking. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. As someone who spent a little time studying some border areas in Europe about 10 or 15 years ago, one of the interesting things to see was when people live on one side of the border and shop on another side of the border or work on another side of the border, they really, it starts giving real meaning to this third nation idea.
Yes.
That you're talking about. Of course, that's made possible in Europe by things like the Schengen Agreement and so forth, where you no longer have what I experienced a week and a half ago, 2-hour wait just to go from Canada to the U.S. That's Canada,
Right.
So I guess the question is, for all the ferocity and problematic character of these borders, these walled borders, to what extent is it actually working to undermine the third nation reality that has this deep historical resonance you've given us?
I think it's interrupted people's lives and inconvenienced them, but it hasn't seriously changed things yet. The volume of trade between Mexican side and our side is going up. People that I know, they simply factor the wait times into their commute time. Instead of allowing an hour or half an hour to get across the border, they'll allow 2 hours because that's what is required. They don't like it, but they've factored it into in that way. There are obvious adjustments that people make. Some people go back less now than they did before. Some people have told me that when a woman goes back to see her family, she dresses in dowdy clothes, she parks on the U.S. side, she walks over, and her relative meets them there in a kind of a grubby, rundown car, not to draw attention to an affluent person crossing the border. But those are all relatively minor adjustments, I think. People are inconvenienced by them, but I don't think that third nation connectivity is really interrupted. If it goes on for an indefinite period of time, I can see some damage being done. But you also the last thing I want to remind you is that as we've closed the border, we're introducing portals into that fence at record numbers, because the official ports of entry are so important to our trade that we'll pretty much grant a port of entry anywhere that applies for it, because we do rely on the trade. So there's one of those lovely paradoxes whereby we're closing the border down, but at the same time we're maximizing the number of openings in it so you can cross officially. I think you're not going to stop this third nation. By the time yes, sir.
What do you think to the idea that borders are actually keeping people in as well, rather than the idea of supposedly to keep people coming into these states? It's actually keeping a lot of these immigrants in.
Correct. Yeah. I think that one effect of the wall, the tertiary fence I showed in that image from San Luis, was to prevent people from going back into Mexico. And it becomes so difficult to cross now, relatively speaking, and it's also become criminalized because the cartels have got involved in human trafficking. I'm actually truly amazed at the courage of people who make this move. I don't think I'd have the courage to do it. But the real point of your question, of course, was because it's so difficult now to cross back and forth as it was before, people stay here. And that's changed the demographics of the place quite dramatically. I mean, there is no way for us in this country right now to stop the Latinization of our population. The Latino population is having children at a faster rate, and they already are a majority in some places. They're going to be a majority in a lot more places simply by natural increase, no matter what happens with immigration anymore. So people are staying, they're not going back, and it's a problem that we created. Yes?
I really enjoyed your talk and look forward to reading the book. I wonder if you're focused on the border itself and the third nation, the harm that we do there, does that detract a bit from thinking about the harm to the actual individuals that are in that gulag, or that are living in these families that can't get together, that are divided by the border and the border industrial complex and the surveillance and all the other things that you described. You lose the focus on that part.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very interesting point. In fact, one of the things that I do in one of the later chapters is to try to put the story of El Paso and Juarez in perspective, and also Arizona. I mean, Arizona's not great, right? So we've seen there, I began talking about it a moment ago, the effect on people's lives is quite intense. The effect of people's lives in detention is appalling. The effect of people's lives when they are deported is appalling. And I follow some of those stories through just to give an idea about how bad that is. Obama has promised to clean up a lot of the detention centers because they're unaccountable. They have enormously unproductive strategies. And one of them is, for example, is called churning. Which is to say, when your prison is filled up, you transfer some people to other places, or even if you're not filled up and your other prison, run by the Corrections Corporation of America, in another part of the town has got too high a vacancy rate, you move people to it anyway. That way, it's almost like the only way we'll let Mexicans into this country as like fodder for our prison machine. And just to give you a very quick example, I mean, there was one young girl in LA. She'd been fighting in the schoolyard with her sister. They called the cops. Cops came and discovered that she was illegal. She was on her way to Miami within 24 hours before the family caught up with her, and she would have been deported. Because when you're caught here in one place, you can be shipped anywhere across the country, and in a private detention system, there's all sorts of ways to prevent you and your lawyers from catching up with your loved ones once they're in the machine. When people tell me, and they tell me often, my daughter or son's been put in detention centers, I say, get after them as fast as you can. Don't lose track of them. Those are horror stories. And the faster we clean that up, the better. This whole border industrial complex issue is a cause of some concern, I think, because there's so many vested interests in the prison system, in the border patrol people, in the equipment, in the towers, Boeing, Blackwater, all the other security providing companies. I mean, there's too much money involved in that. Last question. Nope. Then go and buy a gazillion books. There's only 10,000 copies in the lobby. If you don't want to buy a copy, it's okay, I'll still speak to you. But thank you very much for coming.